Hello everyone, this is Karthik Singh again. People who haven't joined the last session, welcome now. I hope last session was a great learning for you all. Now moving further with our next session, which will be led by Mr. Jisse. He's from Netherlands, founder of Vue. He himself is an mentor and a trainer to many of the developers across the globe. Today he'll be sharing you insight on Vue Storefront 2 and Magento 2, which will definitely gonna help you all to get started with VSF 2 and Magento. So make sure you learn most from him. Over to you, Jisse.
Hey everyone, good morning to me at least. Maybe it's already afternoon for you. But yeah, welcome to my talk. Before actually introducing myself, I would like to say a big thank you to the people of Oriate Labs who put together this wonderful Vue Storefront conference, specifically for India. But I think actually a lot of the content here is going to be useful to others as well. So big thank you to Karthik and Leka and Piyush and others who are basically working really hard to make all of this possible. And thank you, first of all, also for inviting me as a speaker. Sometimes I feel a little bit as an outsider to the Vue Storefront community because I'm doing so many other things, but hopefully I've got something nice to put on the table. So hopefully through this presentation you're going to see whether it's actually worth it or not. So yeah, maybe to briefly introduce myself with a big face also staring at you. My name is Jisse Reitsma. I'm from the Netherlands. I'm the founder of a little company called Yurio, and it's a really small company with actually only one permanent employee, and that's me, but also a couple of freelancers. And together with those freelancers, I put together a couple of conferences in the past. Made Testfest twice, Reacticon 4 times, and I'm going to talk about Reacticon in a few moments, even a bit more. I've been awarded also a Magento Mastership, but mostly I'm dealing actually with training backend developers and front-end developers. And in the past, that would also always be specifically for Magento and a couple of other front-end technologies like Vue Storefront. But lately, I've also been adding shopware to that story. And that also was kind of like my introduction to Vue Storefront. But let me explain all of that in a few moments. Before I actually want to get started with my personal story, I wanted to also stand still for a moment what is happening in the world, or specifically also what is really happening really close to the people of Vue Storefront. They're all from Poland. And in Poland, actually, there's a border with Ukraine, and you know about all of the news in there. It's a horrible thing that is happening right there with the invasion and with the war. But the awesome thing is actually that the people of Vue Storefront are also picking up upon this. So the photo that you see right here is actually taken by one of the people of the Vue Storefront team, because more than a week ago, they actually purchased this bus, and they've been driving up and down actually between the border and the different cities in Poland and maybe somewhere further into Europe as well, to basically help Ukrainian refugees to do something. And for me, that's actually where the slogan also comes from. Vue Storefront is green in multiple different ways. So first of all, the house color of Vue Storefront is definitely green. You will see that throughout the whole conference. But also if you mix up the colors of the Ukrainian flag, blue and yellow, you get green as well. So for me, because of the actions that Vue Storefront is now doing to help out other people from Ukraine, definitely they get a little bit greener because of it. So yeah, big thank you also to the people of Vue Storefront for not only coming into action, but also because of, well, the stuff that they do on the technical side. Because that's also where my path began, actually, with meeting up with Vue Storefront, specifically with Philip himself, who's also a speaker at this conference. I met up with him as a speaker at Reacticon 1. There were the first 2 Reacticon conferences took place live in the Netherlands, and then actually afterwards I also organized it twice online. But actually at the first Reacticon we met up and we started talking about what Vue Storefront was really about, and it basically intrigued me up to the moment that I'm still really enthusiastic about whatever Vue Storefront is doing. I started to do live training, I started to do consults and coding experiments. I visited them in their hometown, Wrocław, and that's not Wrocław, but Wrocław. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it even correctly, but basically in their home country in Poland. And then somewhere along the line when COVID also started to happen, I decided to turn my live trainings into a Vue Storefront 1 on-demand training. And that's currently my path into Vue Storefront 1. Now I'm going to talk about the differences between Vue Storefront 1 and Vue Storefront 2 in a moment or so. But I also wanted to show you a little bit what else is playing. So for instance, Shopware PWA is in this listing as well. And I'm not sure if anyone else is mentioning it because there's no specific topic on Shopware PWA in this Vue Storefront conference. However, Shopware PWA is actually nothing more than Vue Storefront 2, but then not for Magento, but for Shopware, obviously. And I started to work together with Shopware as well, and together with Vue Storefront and Shopware, I put together this PWA on-demand training, which is slowly coming to being now. So currently it's still Q1, early March or half of March in 2022, but in Q2, somewhere in April, I'm expecting to deliver actually the first big chunk of videos for Shopware PWA. And then afterwards, I hope to dive into Vue Storefront 2 in general as well, even though Shopware PWA is already part of that same story as well. But theoretically, the story I'm going to tell you right now about Magento 2 and its Vue Storefront integration is going to be part of that same training as well. And that's basically also where I need to maybe differentiate between Vue Storefront 1 and Vue Storefront 2. So Vue Storefront 1 is very much alive currently. And that might surprise you, but there's a lot of agencies, there's a lot of developers actually still choosing Vue Storefront 1 simply because, well, it's worth it. It has a tight integration with Magento 1 and Magento 2. Regarding the stability, the stability is awesome already. There's a requirement for a node middleware layer, and sometimes people are frightened because of this. But simply put, with Vue Storefront 2, we also need that. Plus, with Vue Storefront 1, this node middleware it takes care of server-side rendering in general, which is something that you need to take care of once you build your own app with Vue or React or any other single-page application. Even though it's a little bit tough. But I think actually Vue Storefront 1 has a solid code base. The only big downside is actually that a lot of that code that was in there, or that is in there, has been written actually through old projects of Vue Storefront, or the company behind Vue Storefront, Divanti. And because of that, actually, I consider a lot of the source code in Vue Storefront legacy. And because of that, actually, I was pretty enthusiastic and excited as soon as I learned about Vue Storefront 2, which is based upon Nuxt, which is a requirement therefore for a node middleware layer where Nuxt.js, the server side, is taking care of server-side rendering. Nuxt is also slowly moving from Vue 2 to Vue 3, and currently Vue Storefront is therefore still based upon Vue 2. However, we can already use parts of Vue 3 in Vue 2 already, and that's, for instance, the composition API, and through Vue composables we can actually make use of them. But for the major part, the thing that I'm really getting enthusiastic about is actually the fresh start that we have with things. Now, that's kind of like the general introduction of how I got started with Vue Storefront. And before actually moving into the real topic of getting started with Magento 2, its integration with Vue Storefront, or I should say it the opposite way, Vue Storefront, its integration with Magento 2. Let me actually talk or introduce a couple of concepts that I believe that are really important. And actually, I'm going to talk about these concepts throughout the whole talk in the upcoming slides. Instead of actually seeing Vue Storefront as just another front end for Magento, you should actually look at it from a different point of view. So with Magento, we always had this concept of parent and child theming, for instance, while with Vue apps in general, and therefore also Nuxt, and therefore also Vue Storefront itself, we shouldn't be talking about parent and child theming necessarily, but we should talk about the composition API and composables and building our own Vue components on top of it, instead of actually trying to extend upon existing components. And that concept, so actually all 3 bullet points are talking about the same kind of idea. That concept is sometimes a little bit harder to sell towards Magento developers, because we're expecting as Magento developers this parent and child theming, but maybe we should be expecting something else, and that's kind of like what I'm trying to sell here through this whole presentation. But yeah, bear with me. I'm slowly getting to my point in the upcoming slides. Because, the first 10 minutes are already over, while I actually want to talk about the real Magento 2 integration. First of all, it's not ready yet. So as of yet, it's still in heavy progress. There's a lot of different things happening, that Magento 2 integration is offered as open source, but there's still help needed around. So once you get into this Magento 2 integration, first of all, make sure that you understand that not everything is ready yet. Second, there might be bugs where instead of you complaining about it, you should actually collaborate and work together with the core developers to try to fix all of those issues. And third, maybe instead of trying to identify bugs, it may be even more awesome if you try to identify missing features and stand up and try to collaborate with all of those core developers to try to complete those features as well. So in short, it's work in progress. And I think actually that by looking at the features as of yet, there's already a lot of things happening. So most of the product types are being supported. The CMS pages and blocks are supported, and Page Builder not yet. There's a lot of work still needs to be done regarding the customer account. But I think in general, there's already plenty of details in here to start building your own shop and actually completing it as well, if you have the right amount of knowledge. So there we go. Actually, that's also my duty to help you getting started with all of this in a controlled and in a good manner. So it's work in progress, and because of that, actually, I want to say thank you also to all of those people that are making this possible. So there's a couple of agencies involved here: Cyberviews, Leonex, and Caravel X or Caravel, and there's multiple different individual developers behind all of those agencies. And without them, actually, all of this work wouldn't be possible. So Vue Storefront itself takes care of the major job of maintaining the core, and we're going to talk about that architecture of that core sooner or later. But then on top of it, there's a certain integration, and that integration is basically thanks to these developers that are actively involved with that project. So yeah, it's awesome that they've been building all of that, and basically through that, I'm able to explain you already an installation procedure and getting started and how to make your first customizations, but also consider this kind of like maybe your introduction into open source development to make sure that the core is also becoming better as well. All right, so the real getting started, of course, starts with installing Vue Storefront itself. And for this, actually, there's two sides of the story that you need to take care of. Node, for instance, Node needs to be runtime version 16 or higher. Or higher, that's not there yet. And if Node 17 would be out, I would definitely not recommend you to use it yet, because that's the unstable branch. So Node 16, then it's actually settled for. And also you need to have the latest version of Magento 2.4.3 in this case. Patch 1 doesn't really matter, but this definitely needs to be the minimum version. And then within Magento, you need to take care of a couple of other things. First of all, the GraphQL API needs to be enabled. I'm actually personally maintaining this package of so-called composer replacements, and that's pretty awesome if you're running Magento and you don't want to use the GraphQL API, because then actually using this meta package, you can just disable and remove all of those packages at once. But now we actually try to accomplish the other way, the opposite side. So don't remove anything regarding GraphQL, but just make sure that everything is just enabled. And another thing in that same GraphQL API is that there's a certain query complexity and query depth that could be configured. And actually one of those developers that was really active with this Magento 2 integration for Vue Storefront, Caravel, he created a module for this to allow for this query complexity and query depth to be created pretty easily. As soon as I saw that little module, I started to laugh because I created a similar module a year earlier. But that's how it works with open source. I don't really care which one you use, but just make sure that you change that query complexity and query depth in a certain way. And then you're set to go with the actual installation. Now, I also recommend you to have a couple of development tools only. In the browser, it's handy to have this Vue DevTools. You need to have some kind of editor, and personally, I favor things like VS Code over something like PHP Storm as it comes to when it comes to Vue development. And theoretically, you can also dive into GraphQL. I'm going to mention a couple of things about GraphQL later on, but as of yet, I would say it's not really needed for my story, but it would be handy to have a tool like Chrome IQL or Altair in your browser again installed as well. All right, and then afterwards, actually, the installation is pretty simple. Using this npm command, first we install the Vue Storefront CLI globally, and then afterwards we can use that Vue Storefront CLI in the form of VSF by calling upon VSF init and then the name of a new project. So in this case, I'm just checking out the Magento 2 demo as a new folder, and then afterwards, by running this VSF init command, I'm being asked a simple question: what kind of platform do you want to connect to? And then you choose Magento 2. Currently it's actually labeled as beta, but then you're good to go. And actually within a couple of seconds, everything is good to go. And at first, when I was running through that wizard so fast, I thought like, hey, but then something should be missing, right? Because normally if you run the npm installation, you're always waiting for multiple different sources to be downloaded, and that's always time consuming. Well, you're correct. You still need to navigate into that newly created folder. So in this case, in my case, I've created a Magento 2 demo folder, and then run the command yarn install, and that's going to be taking, the time depending upon your internet connection. But then only once that's finished, the only thing that you should do is just run the command yarn dev, and you should be good to go. However, what we're trying to accomplish is we're trying to connect the Vue Storefront app written in Vue and Nuxt and all kinds of other things, and connect that thing towards a remote Magento environment. And we didn't configure anything regarding that Magento environment. So personally, I would recommend you to set up your own Magento instance, and then you need to modify actually the .env file to make sure that your own Nuxt application is connecting to the remote Magento GraphQL as well. So the Nuxt details in there are often just equal. So currently I'm actually running it through port number 3001 because actually the slides that I'm running through is running on port 3000 anyway. And I'm also connecting it towards my own Magento GraphQL environment and base URL, which is the same thing. And theoretically, you can then already play around with other settings like image providers and Magento external checkouts. And I think actually for the majority of all of these different settings, don't look at my slides only, but also just look them up in the documentation of Vue Storefront. It's pretty awesome in already getting you started with all of this as well. So for the installation part, I've just also been copying and pasting actually from their documentation into these slides just to have a sensible story. All right, so the .env file is something that you can just complete with all of those different variables, or you add this little store env in here, and the store env in this case is pointing to dev. And as soon as you create dev as a name, then actually you're supposed to configure this other JSON file in a config folder, in this case called dev.json, and that could be looking like the following. It's actually resembling all of these other variables that we just used in the earlier slide, but now copied from a .env file into a JSON file. It's two different approaches, and which one you prefer, it's basically a little bit up to you. All right, so far so good. And let me actually demo a little bit of what you should be having at that moment. So I'm actually going to exit the full page screen right here. And then you can actually see that under this specific tab, I already have this environment up and running. Or let me actually just double check also in my VS Code environment. So in my VS Code environment, I've got all of these different details, components and composables and the configuration. And in this case, actually the configuration is just an example file, while my personal configuration is actually in that .env file. So this is all detailing a specific local environment. And then actually afterwards, I should be running this command yarn dev. That's going to take a little bit of time. It might be throwing also specific warnings or maybe errors, but the main thing is actually that you would like to see the building process that I'm making a little bit smaller right here, but both a client-side, now it looks really weird, but a client-side compilation and a server-side compilation. And once actually both are complete to 100%, then actually it's proving that all of the client-side browser code, the JavaScript code, is turned into browser code, and then actually we should be able to refresh that page on the server on the browser side. So currently a server compiled successfully, and then last but not least, yeah, it's looking a little bit weird because of those warnings that I mentioned, but also the client compilation has been successful as well, which means actually that currently I've got a running environment. I can navigate actually through a couple of categories here, and well, most of the stuff is just working. thing. The funny thing in my case is actually the original Magento site. It has been installed with Venya data, and Venya is actually the default theme of Magento PWA Studio. So the competition. But anyway, so it's nice to know that any kind of demo that you have in Magento itself is just something that could be forwarded into Vue Storefront. Of course, knowing about those limitations in the Magento 2 integration that are still there. All right, so I just wanted to talk about that we have this live environment, because then we can talk also about what it is to customize code. And actually customizing code goes from one end to the other. Of course, we can do all kinds of different things, but I'm just trying to get started with a couple of scenarios. So for instance, it's pretty common to override specific pages. And I'm going to show you actually kind of like the procedure per grouping, but we can override specific pages, aka also layouts. We can override components, we can override CSS files or instructions. We can work with composable and GraphQL queries and etc. But all of this is something that I would like to comment upon by focusing upon the big question: how can we do this with the least amount of core hacks as possible? Because if there's source code and I can go into that source code, obviously I can just hack my way around and I can change the HTML and whatever. But as soon as the first upgrade is going to be there, improving the stability of this Magento 2 integration, then obviously I want my own local copy to be updated as smoothly as well. So doing this in an organized way is kind of like the bottom line. That's basically what I'm trying to get to in short steps. Now, the first thing here is overriding pages, and I'm just mentioning actually 3 different scenarios, and maybe the second one is the worst one, because then we would go into the original pages folder and make any kind of modification there. And if I'm just opening up my VS Code editor again, let me just briefly explain what I'm actually after. In my own environment, I've got this pages folder, and then you can actually see that a couple of those pages are kind of like static, and whatever is actually starting with an underscore is more dynamic, but well, it's a little bit hidden from this area because of the extending part that this application is actually extending upon the core. So there's more difficulties behind this whole thing. But the main thing is basically that if I would like to modify the home page, for instance, I would go in and modify that source code. And theoretically, if we zoom into that source code on its own, we can actually see that source code is consisting out of a template and then calling upon this SF hero component. And it has been mentioned already in other presentation as well, that Vue Storefront is offering many different things, but one of those things is the Storefront UI library, the component library. Well, here you can see it in action. And by modifying properties right here, we can influence basically the hero and the hero items within it. In a similar way, we can also work with a banner grid and hydrate it in a certain way with products that are then also labeled right here. And if we scroll down, we can also see that there's a scripting tag or scripting section here as well, importing all of these other child components, and all of those child components are then set up in a certain way so that with the Vue 3 or Vue 2 composition API, everything becomes responsive as well, or reactive as well. But the bottom line is it's basically a large file, and in that large file there's so many different things to modify. So theoretically you can go in and modify this, but theoretically for a homepage, I would also say that it's maybe a good idea just to replace it with your own homepage, because you know best what your own homepage should be like. And maybe this little code here is just getting started for you. So making direct modifications here is maybe not that bad after all. However, once you get into the My Account view, then you can actually see that it's again calling upon smaller and smaller components right here. And all of those components are imported yet using other child components, which obviously brings in another question. What if I want to not override this My Account component, but what if I want to override the order history component, for instance? How to do that? Well, I'm slowly getting to that story in a few moments. But as of yet, I see this as maybe a component, a page component that I would like to modify less, because there's so much code in here that I would like to keep. And if I override the file itself, then it's actually just, well, making sure that I'm maintaining the majority of that code instead of actually me relying upon it. Well, there's multiple ways to try to overcome that problem. For instance, what we could do is we could modify the routes.js file. That routes.js file is right here. And by just looking at the routes file, you can see that for a specific URL, a specific component is being loaded. And theoretically, I can introduce my own component here and then try to make use of the original component within my own component. But as of yet, I think actually with a lot of these components for pages, or I should say page component, it's actually something that you simply need to modify or leave out that modification. Or theoretically, you can also just work around with little tips and tricks with Nuxt middleware. But I consider that actually kind of like upper magic and darker magic. So if you're familiar with Nuxt, you should know that through a Nuxt middleware, you should be able to extend the router, and through that router modify specific routes, and through those route properties maybe also influence all of the components that are residing in that subfolder pages. But yeah, it's a little bit cumbersome. It's a little bit harder. In a similar way, a page is always loading its own content within a specific layout. And whatever I just mentioned about pages is also basically applying to layouts. So I think in both cases, I would say that either you try to not modify anything there, or you try to just create your own based upon that original that is there. Now, there's a lot more to say about all of these different conversations, right? So there's the overriding of CSS, but in general, that CSS file is just empty. So I would say, yeah, just hack your way in, and then it's totally fine. But then from any kind of other file that is in there, it could be that more files are going to be included. And as a little example in there, I just demonstrated one of those components, like the home component, which is importing all of those other child components. And what if you want to modify actually the look and feel of that Instagram feed instead of actually everything else within this homepage? Well, then actually you would still need to override the page itself, the homepage, and then override all of its other pathings, and then duplicate that Instagram feed component and then customize it. And that's actually where the troublesome part of overriding code becomes really an annoying thing. And instead of actually doing all of that, I would actually favor much more of a parent and child theming story, where you could basically just copy that original file to a different location, so that the compiler within Nuxt is actually going to look into that new location instead of the old location. That new location is simply just doing its stuff in there. Well, to allow for this, I've written a Vue Storefront Webpack plugin, and actually here's the link. The slides are going to be shared with you later, but that link is going to tell you how to install everything. And the bottom line is actually that what you could do is just copy a component from one location to another, and the only limitation is actually that if I would do this, for instance, for a component like I don't know, the actually one example that I frequently use is this topbar.vue. Then I could copy it from one location to another, like here. And then as soon as I've done that, I need to realize that actually within that copied code, there might be still paths that are referring to the old location. So if I want this to be changed into that original location, I would need to change that // into actually a more absolute path. It's not really absolute, but kind of like this. And then actually this would work just totally fine. And as of yet, this is just a working plugin that hopefully is helping you out. I was intending to do a little demo, but yeah, the presentation shouldn't be too long. But do let me know if there's any questions about it. I'm happy to help you along with everything here as well. Now, there's other things that we can override as well. There's composables, but in general, you don't want to override composables. You want to compose your own composables out of existing composables. It's a little bit crazy, but once you get into the composition API, once you understand that composables are nothing more than functions that receive input and deliver output, then it starts to make more sense. There's other parts specifically for the Magento 2 integration, like modifying GraphQL queries, where actually it's the same kind of overriding trick that I've mentioned, but now in a similar way or in a different way, because the location where all of those queries are from is the API client, which is there in the node_modules folder. So it's hidden kind of like a level deeper, but still allowing you to actually go in and modify a specific query in a certain way. For instance, if you want to display certain attributes of products on a product listing page, then actually this is one of those things that you should take care of. But in general, actually, we're still then talking about extending upon the existing functionality. And that's kind of like where my story is ending here with this getting started. So hopefully I've shown you a couple of things about how to install things, how to get started with things, and also how to override things by using my Webpack plugin. But that same thing doesn't stop you there from making more modifications. So there's in Nuxt itself, there's multiple different ways to extend upon the whole story. Plugins and modules, actually also middleware. Vue also has plugins. Webpack could be extended upon by using different plugins as well. In the Magento 2 integration, there's a specific thing for image providers. So the thing goes on and on and on. There's so much to extend upon. But the big question there is also, what are you going to extend upon and what is the end result? Is that end result really looking like a site like the following? Do you have a sliding in from the left of this filter menu? Do you have a button that looks like the following? Are you able to accomplish your own graphical design by using the exact same components that were designed for specifically this demo? And I personally favor actually the other answer, and I would say no, it's not always that case. Sometimes you actually need to go in and actually rewrite everything from scratch. Sometimes it's better to build things from scratch and building it your own instead of actually just extending upon something else. So whatever actually that demo is currently at, realize that actually your own code should be involving a lot of different Vue components. You should have knowledge about the Nuxt plugin and the Nuxt architecture on its own to make sure that you are extending upon that Nuxt application as well. And definitely also you should know about the composables, because the real goal with Vue Storefront 2 is actually that all of the logic has been moved out of components. Components have become simple, dumb presentational components and moved into actually the composable functions. That's actually what I think actually is this real extensibility. It allows you to build your own Vue Storefront component tree and then actually still make use of those composables to actually offload the harder parts. Well, that's actually the main conclusion that I wanted to give you with my presentation. We talked about the getting started bit, but actually it's also getting started as a Vue developer opposed to being a Magento developer. So instead of thinking about parent and child theming, I wanted to introduce this composability as a concept, and hopefully that was to your liking. Let me know if there's any questions, if there's still time to answer those questions.